I'd like to start by also acknowledging the Kaurna people, the traditional owners of the land we stand on today, and their elders past and present. Thank you particularly to the Heritage Council for the invitation to come and talk to you. I feel very flattered that I am in a position, or you think I'm in a position, to be able to offer something to your deliberations today. It's perhaps particularly apposite, as the last time I was in Adelaide a year ago, and this is where I hope my machine works, I left carrying in my bag the Qantas Australian Tourism Award for Best Cultural and Tourism Attraction. The Port Arthur Historic Site, after never previously winning a national award, also won the Best Tourist Attraction, which more fittingly travelled home in the bag of the CEO. And for those who didn't know, the South Australian finalists for each of those categories were the West Terrace Cemetery and Adventure Bay Charters. While what you can see is our, I consider it our Academy Award style picture. I think you'll agree with me that the after party one is far more relaxed. Our CEO had been waiting for this for 15 years. I think it was a case of always the bridesmaid, never the bride. But in that 15 years, we had certainly taken out our fair share of Tasmanian awards and also been runner-up on numerous occasions with the national awards. To add insult to injury, to our competitors' injury, that year, Tasmania took out 12 of the awards. And this is us standing in your beautiful Adelaide sunshine under the beaming smile of our very, very happy Premier. But while winning tourism awards is certainly breathtaking, and the parties are always good fun, I do from time to time gently remind my colleagues that it's hard to match the euphoria in 2010 in Brasilia, and I happened to be there, of being part of the successful World Heritage nomination for the Australian Convict sites. Now, I apologise. I apologise, I need to drink a lot. Don't take that the way that might potentially sound. I apologise for those of you who may be sort of immersed in some way or other with knowledge about the Australian convict sites, but I'll just bore you for a few seconds. But it basically consists of 11 places across Australia. It's unlike the Narracot listing up until us was, I think, the first Australian serial listing, but we upped that to 11 places, which just to complicate it is actually 12 because 2 places were whacked in together. And it's a very exciting opportunity for us to work as a group, and it echoes some of the messages that have been said already about the importance of spreading your messages out and being able to engage with a much broader community and a much broader number of places that are geographically spread. Having said that, I'm not convinced we're doing it very well. But of them, most of you would know that we manage the Port Arthur Historic Site, this lovely, lovely landscape. But we also manage the Coal Mines Historic Site, which is about 30 minutes away on the peninsula, and more recently the Cascades Female Factory Historic Site, all of which are part of that World Heritage listing. So you can appreciate that that's a little bit of a challenge for us. What's more interesting at the moment is that the Tasmanian government has approached us to take over managing a 4th site, Darlington Probation Station on Maria Island. And interestingly, this is because the government sees that we can provide something which they delightfully call the Port Arthur model, which is the capacity to balance success in both tourism and heritage. And they believe that by engaging us in management of not just the probation station, but more broadly the island, which is a bit scary because it's got things like wombats and Tasmanian devils, which aren't really part of our expertise. But they're convinced that there will be a much better opportunity, and yes, getting back to what the Minister was saying, with better financial outcomes for the government if they change their management. We're sort of, the jury's out from our perspective. So what I'd like to do today, if I get time and Beverly doesn't wave her cards at me, is to cover 3 topics, starting with the background on Port Arthur and how and why we got to where we are today. I'd like to then follow with a discussion that places that success in a broader economic and political context, and then some comments on the outcomes of our recent Legislative Council inquiry into built heritage and tourism. So, first, a Reader's Digest through the how and why of the Port Arthur Historic Site Management Authority, the Port Arthur Historic Sites establishment as a key heritage site and as a tourism destination. The site, I think, as most of you would know, has got a fairly extraordinary history. Prior to settlement as a convict prison in 1830, it was home to the Paitaram people, a clan of the Oyster Bay tribe, although there were no records of Aboriginal people remaining on the peninsula beyond the early 1830s. I think the story of the Tasmanian treatment of our Aboriginal people warrants a far greater attention than I have the opportunity to do today. But in 1833, new ideas about reforming criminals were sweeping the world, and Port Arthur was seen as an ambitious experiment, a period of social advancement that many believe set the tone for modern-day prison reform. At its peak, there were 2,000 convicts, soldiers and civil staff living on the settlement. And it was a major industrial production site, which I think is something that's very often missed. By 1877, the prison had served its purpose, but not before the very creative Marcus Clarke had published his powerful tale For the Term of His Natural Life. Whilst it was inspired by a trip to Port Arthur, I think it was, as with most authors, highly embroidered with some nice bits of fiction. But what it meant is it grabbed the imagination of the Australian public, who immediately began to flock to Port Arthur. And it transformed the penal settlement into a tourism destination almost overnight. A township was gradually imposed across the convict landscape, and like I think most growths in rural areas, it absorbed and rejected elements as it needed and as inspiration dictated. In 1877, there was no road to the site. Undeterred, though, visitors arrived by steamship. Experience, I think that's interesting in itself, because that was experiencing the same sense of arrival as the convicts had. But during this time, many of its buildings were earmarked for sale in order to recoup some of the vast expense that had gone into into running the penal settlement. And also, there was a push, which, as many of you would know, went on for multiple decades to erase the dark stain of tourism across the countryside and from our history. The settlement ended up becoming the central township of the region, and industries flourished, including agriculture, fishing, timber, but more particularly tourism. And these form the backbone of an economy that still exists today. The Commandant's house converted readily into a hotel, and one of the things I think is more interesting was that the separate prison was going to be converted into hotel apartments. I think you'd really have to have some imagination to take this and fancy, your five-star resort. However, this initiative was compromised by the perennial forces of the Australian landscape when the structure was severely damaged by bushfires in the 1890s, as was a great deal of the site. But I think that the plans for the separate prison were perhaps an ancestral echo of the realities of modern prison conversions into domestic structures. I think we'd all be aware of what's recently happened with Pentridge in Melbourne. And for those who there seems to be a market for, who want a potentially terror-filled nighttime experience. I was reading the other day that they have actually, a Russian entrepreneur is busy making opportunities in one of the gulags in Siberia, where apparently Solzhenitsyn was incarcerated, so that you can go and have your overnight experience there. I think truly extraordinary. Having said that, I think the Reverend Woolnough, who was the hotel entrepreneur in this case, may have well have been ahead of his time in an arena that we're now starting to talk about as dark tourism. Whilst the economic mainstays of rural life continued to progress, they were outpaced by a burgeoning tourism industry. With the natural beauty of the Tasman Peninsula landscape, which I'm sure many of you would be familiar with, of far less interest for many than the macabre and grisly telling of the convict story. Visitors were attracted very much to the fact you could get a first-hand experience of the horrors of the convict station, which included guided tours by old lags, as ex-convicts were colloquially known. William Thompson's a very interesting character. He ended up as a guide at the site, was incarcerated at both the coal mines and Port Arthur, but left behind, very interestingly, a diary or an autobiography, which we suspect he had a lot of help in writing, not so much because of the words, but of the opinions. And we had the joy of transcribing and publishing it, so it's available in our bookshop should anybody wish a copy. The first half of the 20th century saw the steady growth of Port Arthur as a rural community and the persistent survival of the tourism industry as a key driver of community commercial interests. However, it's interesting because it was also during this period that heritage and conservation interests began to consolidate, with the establishment of the Scenery Preservation Board by the Tasmanian government in 1915 and the gazettal of the church, the penitentiary and Point Pool, which is our boys' prison, as reserves in the following year. So if you do your maths, that means that 100 years ago this year, so we're celebrating our centenary of the gazettal. We like a party, so no doubt we'll be able to throw one in August when the 100th anniversary occurs. But by 1948, most of the township was reserved as a historic site, which began to impact non-tourism usages of the area. Various government committees managed the site until the Tasmanian National Parks and Wildlife Service took over in 1971. And it was around this time, though, that there emerged a growing collision between the interests of tourism, the interests of community, and the interests of conservation. In 1987, the Port Arthur Historic Site Management Authority, PASMA, was established under its own Act of Parliament, and we took over management from the then Parks and Wildlife Service. I'm not going to go through all our main functions. If you're really excited, you can read the legislation. But I think the really important thing about it is that it enshrined in legislation that the Port Arthur Historic Site Management Authority was responsible not just for the conservation of the site, but also for the provision of a best practice visitor experience. And then the last dot point, which is we're charged with making sure we can secure financial assets and resources for the organisation as well. But today, I'm going to go for who's not been to Port Arthur? Few. Okay, this is what you're missing. Today, the Port Arthur Historic Site can be described as an open-air museum. It's a rich cultural landscape. I'm actually reading from the guidebook here, spanning 40 hectares and containing more than 30 historic buildings, extensive ruins, reconstructed gardens and grounds. Our marketing people fail to understand the landscape actually covers some 200 hectares. It just includes uninteresting things like the sewage treatment plant and the water supply and a whole lot of foreshore that we have responsibility for. So if you can imagine, it's not just that we look after, and then we've got another 200 hectares of land at the coal mines. Keeps us busy. But PASMA's ability to deliver an outstanding experience in cultural tourism is reflected by the fact that we've been in the top 4 most visited attractions in Tasmania. And we're quite amazed when in January last year, our daily visitor record was exceeded by 200, when we had 4,008 visitors arrive by both land and sea. I plan to talk about this a bit later, but we now, with our lovely harbour, are visited by a lot of cruise ships. Well, that was good. That was really exciting for us, but you can't even imagine the looks on our faces when January this year we had a daily record of 4,800 and we hit a monthly January record with 58,000 people. So I'm not sure, I don't think anyone will be surprised to find that our major project at the moment is trying to raise some money to expand our visitor centre. It's sort of got a bit small. The historic site entered the TripAdvisor Hall of Fame for consistently high rating reviews over a 5-year period. And from our own visitor statistics and feedback, 93% of our visitors state they'd recommend a visit to family and friends. During the last financial year, we welcomed some 273,000 visitors and another 35,000 evening visitors, because I think most people know we also run ghost tours. It was a record-breaking year for us, and we already know we're going to be hugely over that record this year. It's important for us to remember, though, that our tourism success is inseparable from the fact that the Port Arthur Historic Site is a place of outstanding heritage value at a local, at a state, at a national and at an international level. We have our, like most organisations, we have a vision, and our vision is to conserve, manage and promote the Port Arthur Historic Sites, we had to add an S on that when we took over a few others, as cultural tourism places of international significance. And as such, we strive to balance the conservation, interpretation and celebration of our unique heritage and cultural values with those of an outstanding visitor tourism experience. This is primarily achieved through our statutory management plan, which has a cornerstone philosophy, and I pause for effect here, that nothing is more important than protecting the heritage values of the site. We've translated this into our tourism management into a number of policies, some of which I thought might be worth noting. The first is that we provide an authentic and meaningful cultural heritage experience. The second is that we are obliged to tell all levels of the community, or to give them the opportunity to access and to experience their cultural heritage. The other is to understand and manage the risk of damage to heritage values arising from visitor impact or intentions that arise from management of interventions to facilitate or control visitor activity. And then finally, is there is a potential conflict between the need to generate revenue and the heritage values of the sites. And it is that conflict, I think, that many of you would understand with some of the issues that you're dealing with. Our heritage and conservation activities are further underpinned by the philosophy that through interpretation comes understanding, through understanding comes appreciation, and through appreciation can come protection. Both the pre- and post-convict settlement heritage are integral chapters of Port Arthur's narrative, and it is our responsibility to provide visitors with appropriate information so that they can comprehend the totality of this evocative and extraordinary site. I think with the World Heritage Listing, it actually emphasised how important it is. While on one hand, our World Heritage is about convict history, on the other, we have a much longer history post-convictism. And as a matter of fact, as I keep reminding some of our colleagues, we have a much longer tourism history than we ever had a convict history. 20 years ago, next week, Parsba and the community will commemorate one of the more horrendous events in Port Arthur's, and I think indeed Australia's history. The shooting on the 28th of April 1996 by a lone gunman that left 35 dead and another 19 physically wounded. However, these statistics cannot and do not adequately reflect the emotional and psychological damage or the disturbing memories that continue to haunt so many people some 2 decades later. How we tell this story into the future is a huge challenge for the authority. It's one we are currently facing, and it's one that we plan to start to progress once the commemorative service next week is over. Needless to say, it will involve considerable community consultation, and it will not, as some of our detractors have liked to suggest, ever be considered as another Port Arthur tourism product. However, getting back to what we do offer, our decisions to develop new interpretive and tourism products are based on fastidious attention to visitor feedback, emerging markets, and to data that is made available through various agencies, but primarily for us, through Tourism Tasmania and through Tourism Australia. And Caroline touched on some of that data herself in her introduction. I mention this in light of 2 recent successes we've had in addressing emerging markets and the impacts both have had on our visitor growth. I don't think it's any great secret that the fastest growing market, the hugely growing market, international market to Australia is Chinese visitors. There were some 860,000 visitors from China in the calendar year 2014, which was an increase of 18% relative to the year before. And in that year, visitors from China generated 5.7 billion in total expenditure. That's a lot of money. In terms of Tasmania, more than 24,000 Chinese visited Tasmania in the last calendar year. And I think it would be fair to say that PASMA has been at the forefront of what we call China Ready in Tasmania. For some years, we've provided a Mandarin printed visitor guide, and we more recently partnered with the University of Tasmania to appoint Mandarin-speaking staff. So you've distracted me now. To deliver tours and services in Mandarin. Needless to say, most of them actually are Chinese students, and they have worked with us brilliantly. We've included simplified Mandarin wording in many of our signs and in our cafe and in our restaurant. We've also developed a Mandarin app for exploring the site, a consumer-facing website in China, and a Weibo account, which for those of you who don't know is the Chinese version of Facebook. And I believe the graph you see and the year-on-year percentage growth speaks for itself. So having said that, I will say something. You can just see that line going fastly up at a very steep angle. Well, that's our Chinese visitors. I think the interesting statistics, if you look at the last column in the blue area, is the year-on-year growth, that from 2013 to 2014, that our numbers increased by 432%. So this is certainly a market that we need to be considering. The second market is the cruise ship market, taking advantage of which is clearly easier if you are in reasonable driving distance of a major port, such as Hobart, or you actually happen to have a harbour which is deep enough for large ships, and Port Arthur has both. I love this picture. It just to me shows such an interesting sort of juxtaposition of that's actually the historic slipway with an artistic rendition of more about the size of what one of the boats would have been, with the cruise ship and the lighter in the background. Port Arthur's been experiencing consistent growth in this market with an indication that obviously the demand for this experience is also growing. Our discussions with the sector has indicated that more cruise ships would visit our harbour if we provided a better facility for them to disembark their passengers. So in 2014, we were successful in gaining matching government funding through a federal infrastructure tourism grant program to build a purpose-built jetty for loading and unloading people off the little lighters, that little boat. Since then, our numbers have increased somewhat dramatically. We've also come to understand that the cruise ship sector prefers exclusive products that our other visitors might not get. So we introduced what we've called a behind-the-scenes tour that's conducted not by our guides, but by our professional conservation staff. Unfortunately, it's proven to be extremely popular and is often filled to capacity. We had 11 cruise ships in this season. We've just had our last. Next year there's 22. I'm more concerned about how we're going to get our conservation work done. So I'm negotiating for some more staff. But just if I can quantify it to some extent, we estimate that each cruise ship brings something like $80,000 worth of income. And much more as I'd like to pull the professional staff off it. The problem is they love it. They actually really enjoy this opportunity to go out and work with visitors and tell them about what we're doing in our conservation area. But it goes without saying that all of our conservation and tourism operations are underpinned by a number of significant and operational cornerstones. And these range from marketing to IT support to recruiting the right staff, training them, and then for us working in a reasonably sort of remote rural area is retaining them. It also goes to making sure we provide really good day-to-day visitor services and offering experiences that are best practice. This is a photo of one of our cafes. Anyone who works with a visitor, a place where visitors come to, you'd understand how important your food and beverage offerings are. Okay, so now I'm going to hop onto my second area of discussion, which is moving a bit back in time and probably a little bit more boring, to address the political and financial context that led the government to support, given us the support that's been essential for us to get to where we've got to. Commencing in 1974, Port Arthur received Australian government grants under the National Estate Program that helped finance a range of issues, including property acquisition, because at the time the government was actually buying up part of the township of Port Arthur, something the local community never lets us forget. Doing historical documentation, helping with technical expertise and conservation research and activities. This was followed in 1979 by quite strong negotiations between the state and the Commonwealth governments, which actually led to the establishment of a special conservation project over a period of 7 years. At the end of that time, the Commonwealth had dedicated some $9 million in funding. At its conclusion, it was obvious there was a need to more formally engage with how the conservation and tourism of the site progressed. And this led to the establishment of PASMA in 1987. However, what's particularly disappointing was it also led to a cessation of the direct government funding, and in the absence of this, it tipped the balance from best practice conservation to the imperatives of maximising tourism returns. Following the Port Arthur massacre, and what was described, and I quote, as a degree of dissatisfaction with the board and management organisation, particularly over how the site and the staff have been handled by the board. The government appointed a special commissioner to look into matters affecting the Port Arthur historic site and other associated matters. I don't know, some of you may remember, but at the time, the federal government had given money to the site to build a new visitor centre, and it was proceeding in such a way that Australia ICOMOS, the National Trust, and even the Australian Heritage Committee, as it was then, stepped in, and a stop work order was put on it because there was a total disregard, or considered to be a total disregard, for the heritage values and the way the visitor centre was progressing. While one outcome, apart from a better visitor centre, was also the dismissal of the board, the other was that in 2000 the government announced that it would establish, as a Tasmanian government, that it would establish a 5-year funding program for essential conservation work. One of the influential supporters of this was the then Premier, Jim Bacon, who held a belief as well that it would ultimately be in Tasmania's best interest if all the government-owned convict sites were managed under one authority. And it's basically been that philosophy that has led to PASMA being asked to take over 2 sites and, as I mentioned, possibly a fourth. However, this funding was a critical factor in turning around a site, at that time, a site that was in serious difficulty from a conservation point of view, a financial point of view, a human resource and community perspective, because this was just after the massacre. And 16 years later, this funding is now being established in ongoing estimates, and it's now a vital element in the conservation work undertaken by the authority. There are 2 factors that I think continue to underpin this support. The first is that PASMA can demonstrate to the government, and I'm sorry the minister's not here, that outstanding returns continue to be generated for Tasmania as a result of the government investment. This includes substantial heritage, economic, tourism, education and community outcomes. And secondly, the more recent World Heritage listing has provided a strong argument that the need for obligations to be met under both the World Heritage Convention and the operational guidelines. In terms of economic viability, we have provided the government with data that supports the proposal that continued government funding support for conservation work is both essential and, as demonstrated by the outcomes and benefits, is an outstanding investment. And I think that's where you get to Treasury speak. We undertook an economic study in 2009, and it highlighted a number of issues, including the effectiveness of past government support to the Port Arthur historic site, the value of the site itself, that appropriate levels of government assistance required for the conservation program could be quantified in the upcoming 5 years, and that there were potential opportunities and changes to the operating environment which had a high potential to also bring income into the site. At the time, they were talking about us taking over the coal mines. At the time, World Heritage listing was looming. At the time, there was going to be a 5-star resort. That was 10 years ago, and they've only just announced on Friday that it's finally going to be built. And of course, the World Heritage listing. They didn't know about one of the biggest impetuses for tourism on the peninsula at the moment, which is the Three Capes Walk, within a space of only running for 6 months, has doubled the expected numbers and has become a huge success. It leaves from the Port Arthur Historic Site, so it's both a financial and a visitor benefit to us as well. But the study used input-output modelling, and I'm just an archaeologist, so please don't anyone ask any questions about input and output modelling, to determine the site's contribution to the state economy at the 30th of June in 1999, then 2003, and again in 2008. And I know these statistics are a little bit old, but we haven't done any of that modelling subsequently. But as you can see in the table, the study concluded that in addition to significant wage income and employment effects, that Port Arthur contributed some $31 million per annum to the gross state product of Tasmania, which was an increase of $4 million in the period between June 2003 and June 2008. So between 2000 and 2009, with state government funding of $2 million per annum, which some years ago we managed to get increased to reflect CPI, so now it's up around about 2.6 million. PASMA's contribution to the gross state product increased by approximately 11 million per annum, which provided clear evidence to the government that this was a sound investment. While clearly recognising the subjectivities of such an economic analysis, I think that's a bit like the lies, damn lies and statistics, but there are a number of other important issues raised in the report by the economists. The first was that the Port Arthur Historic Site is a most successful operation, but that reflects strongly in favour of the authority and its staff. We have good staff because we have got good funding. So we have got the capacity to attract people from around Australia because they know they will have continuing jobs. Most of the room, I think this is an important one. There is a significant relationship between visitor numbers and conservation spending. With increased conservation spending, you will get increased visitor numbers. The report clearly identified the benefits resulting from the provision of the funding and drew a direct correlation between the funding, allocation, visitation trends and ultimately revenue. And that's the sort of thing that governments want to hear. In terms of other successes, I just want to talk a little bit about grant funding, which I'm sure most of you in this room are aware. For heritage, there's not really a lot. But I think the site has advantages. We've been very successful, and I think we have two advantages. The first is getting back to our long-term and highly qualified staff, is that we have got experience and capacity to undertake major conservation projects. This is the separate prison, which was we've worked on over several years, about a $3 million project. We undertake them with the right staff. We undertake them on time and in budget. The other thing we can do is we can provide surety back to the government that the funding will be acquitted, and I think part of that comes from us being a government business enterprise that's required to report back to the government and each year to go through a formal audit. The second one is that the Port Arthur Historic Site is considered iconic, and I really don't like that word, I never have, because I'm not exactly quite sure what it means. But in our case, I think above and beyond the World Heritage listing, the Port Arthur Historic Site has been a place that has been seen by politicians at all levels as a win-win in the funding world. I'm sorry, I meant to put in this beaming photo of Kevin Rudd and various other politicians at the opening of the separate prison. But So we've been very successful with direct grant and indirect funding, direct grant funding and direct funding from the government for the coal mines, for the separate prison. This is a shot of the inside, which I thought I'd throw in so you can see what we did with, well, Reverend Woolnuff's plan to turn the cells into hotel rooms, and I think they look quite spectacular. Not as hotel rooms though, but as cells. And the other, of course, is the penitentiary. And this is my favourite before and after photo, $7 million later, of which $3 million was contributed by the state government and $2 million by the she's distracted me again, and $2 million by the Australian government. I'd like to finish with my third discussion, which I will truncate now that I've been told I only have 5 minutes left, particularly because I think some of the issues were covered about things that come out of tourism studies. But I just want to, rather than talking about the Australian level, I'd be interested just for a minute at having a look at some things that have come out at the international level. Interestingly enough, when the Tasmanian state government decided to run their inquiry last year, it came not long after a meeting in 2015 in Cambodia it was a world conference on tourism and culture. And I just wanted to share some of the outputs with you because I think they're relevant for us, and they're also particularly interesting because they cover off on a more national and state level. But tourism has grown over recent decades to become one of the leading global socio and economic sectors of our times. Tourism creates immense opportunities for inclusive economic growth and sustainable development through job creation, the regeneration of rural and urban areas, and the appreciation and protection of both the natural and cultural heritage. In 2012, for the first time, over 1 billion international tourists travelled the world, and this number is growing. And in 2014, the World Heritage List reached 1,000 sites. Culture shapes community, it shapes identities, and it fosters respect and tolerance among people and has become a key tourism asset, creating distinctive differences between destinations. And it's that creating those differences that's really important. And almost 40% of tourism has a cultural motivation, and that cultural or heritage motivated tourists tend to contribute more expenditure to local economies, which I think is something that Caroline noted in her words. So if I can just pop onto some of the thoughts that came, that PASMA dealt with with our inquiry, and I think these are some things that are particularly relevant, is that, as we've discussed, tourism makes a substantial contribution to the economic and social health of communities, and that built heritage tourism can contribute to this. That significant economic, Port Arthur, we've shown, and I know other places have shown, that significant economic benefits can come from investment in heritage, but that government-driven programs do need to be adequately resourced and implemented through statewide leadership. In Tasmania, people look to Port Arthur and say, you are doing this really well, we want you to do more, and we want you to do this, and we want you to do that, and take over some more sites. A lot of what we're being asked to do would be far better and far more appropriately done by Heritage Tasmania and Tourism Tasmania, and the only reason they're not doing it is because they're not funded appropriately. So a response to say, let's get somebody else to do it, is one that needs a great deal of reconsideration. The other thing is that people don't just visit places, they want experiences. It's not build it and they will come. What are you going to give them when they get there? You have to provide them with something that allows them to take a message away, and particularly with, I've tried to avoid social media, it's just, I don't know why, but I've stayed away from it, but it's a really scary thing in terms of dealing with how people immediately respond. Which raises another issue, which is about working in partnership, not just with one government agencies, but across the board. Infrastructure development is so important. At the moment, one of the biggest handicaps at the Port Arthur historic site is that if you don't have a Telstra phone, you will get no reception. Not only is that alarming for people who want to ring their families on an Optus phone, but for those multiples of visitors who rely on downloading things and immediately sending photos it's a disaster for them. Totally ruins their social life and isn't particularly good for our marketing. There are a whole range of others, which I'm running out of time, so I shall conclude. But I hope I've included a number of useful points, and I'm sure there'll be many more to come today, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what you all have to say. But I want to leave you with just 3 thoughts. And one is that successful heritage conservation and successful tourism can work well together. The second is that despite my comments earlier about needing funding, we can't wait for it. If the money is not going to come from government, we need to work together in partnerships to work out what opportunities do exist out there for us to formulate a way forward in this area of tourism and conservation. And I think the initiative that the Heritage Council has shown today, with having us all in this room together, is one such opportunity, and I commend the Council for facilitating this forum. And the third, I guess I would like to say is that as distressing as it might be, there is nothing like a good threat to your heritage values to engender concern and support, ergo 7 million for our penitentiary. So thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing you today.